I suppose our focus of my institute is very specifically on adaptation, and very specifically on low and middle income nations, with a particular interest in the least developed nations, the poorest nations. We're unusual that we look in particular at urban areas. Most discussions on adaptation are for nations or for rural areas. Our focus on adaptation is unusual in that there's more discussions on urban areas for mitigation, and we focus on low and middle income nations. I suppose just three things worth remembering: that most of the world's urban population is now in low and middle income nations. Tens of millions of these are very vulnerable to climate change, especially to more severe and frequent storms, to floods, to heat waves. And of course, climate change impacts come on top of a vast backlog in protective infrastructure. Most of the cities I work in, half the city has no storm drains, half the city has no sewers. A third of the city population are living in informal settlements, often on floodplains or on steep slopes. So the worry is that they're very vulnerable to extreme weather already, and climate change will only increase that. Now, the Copenhagen Accord really didn't give much attention to the urgent needs for adaptation in the poorest nations, in the nations most at risk. These are mostly the low-income nations with little power, little influence. They were pretty much marginalized by the discussions leading up to the Copenhagen Accord. Brazil, China, India, all big economic powers and political powers, but there's 100 nations with about 1 billion people who never appear on the list of nations with power and influence. There was some progress on international funding for adaptation. But the difficulty is that it isn't the funding that is actually the main constraint. The main constraint is that there's city governments, local governments that lack the funding, lack the knowledge, and lack the interest in working with those who are most at risk from climate change. In some ways, mitigation becomes so important for low-income nations because rapid mitigation reduces the risks they're going to be exposed to, reduces the need to adapt. To me, the worst outcome is that rich nations will throw money at adaptation and not deliver on the emissions reduction. It's the emissions reduction the rich nations have to deliver on, which will then reduce the increase in risk in low and middle income nations. Okay, what can we anticipate? We know that there's going to be large and increasing risks facing urban populations in most low and middle income nations. Mostly increasing existing hazards as extreme weather, disaster deaths become more common, more frequent. We know that we'll move to catastrophic disasters if global emissions are not reduced. And any reduction targets, emission reduction targets in high-income nations were dropped from the Copenhagen Accord. I think many of us were hoping for, maybe unrealistically, for a commitment to an 80% emissions reduction by 2050. And of course, there's very little association between those that cause climate change and those that face the most serious impacts. Rich nations, rich people, rich enterprises drive the growth in emissions but face the least risks and face the most capacity to adapt. The statistics aren't very strong, but my guess is that if you took the richest 2% of the world's population, they'd have 1,000 times more greenhouse gas emissions per person than the poorest 2%. If you actually look at the poorest rural and urban dwellers, their consumption levels are so low, they almost have no emissions. A lot of what they use are actually renewable resources for fuels. Many of them make a living collecting waste, and if we credit them with the greenhouse gas emissions saved from that, many may have negative growth emissions. Why focus on urban areas in low and middle income nations? Well, they just have such a large population most at risk. The megadeltas in Asia and Africa have enormous populations. Dhaka and Shanghai in Asia, Cairo and Alexandria, which isn't quite in the Nile Delta, but is hugely at risk from sea level rise and storm surges. The city of St. Louis, 1 million people, just inches above sea level rise. You've got the many West African coastal cities. Lagos is the largest, Abidjan, Dakar, Banjul, all very much at risk from the storm surges. Then you've got a vast urban and rural population dependent on glacier melt for water. Although at least the news on this is incredibly good, that there was some mistake about the speed with which the Himalayan glaciers were going to decline, and that is hugely good news that the time horizon for that is much, much more extended.